On the surface, it was supposed to be a dream assignment. For 29-year-old Claudia Kirschhoch, a freelance travel writer based in Brooklyn, the trip promised warm weather, white sand, and another story to add to her growing portfolio. It was May 2000, and Claudia, known among friends for her adventurous spirit and independence, was preparing to head to Cuba for a feature with Frommer's travel guides. But fate intervened. At the last moment, visa complications shut down the Cuba trip. Instead, Claudia was redirected to Jamaica, specifically the Sandals Resort in Negril. It was meant to be a brief detour, a stand-in for the trip she'd lost. For Claudia, it was another opportunity to explore, to soak in the culture, and perhaps turn the sudden change into something worthwhile. She was not the type to dwell on disappointments. Her friends would later describe her as adaptable, someone who could find a story in even the smallest of details. Her parents, Jean and Donald, recalled how travel had always defined their daughter. Raised in Long Island before settling in Brooklyn, Claudia had cultivated a life around exploration and words. She was disciplined, but not rigid. A woman who carefully balanced responsibility with a hunger for new experiences. At 29, she had already crisscrossed countries, recording her impressions for readers who lived vicariously through her essays. The flight to Jamaica carried with it a sense of unpredictability. For Claudia, the Caribbean wasn't entirely foreign. She'd visited tropical destinations before, chasing both work and the sheer thrill of being somewhere new. Yet Jamaica was different. Negril, perched on the western coast of the island, was marketed as a paradise. A place where turquoise waters kissed the sand, and where luxury resorts walled themselves off from the harsher realities outside their gates. When Claudia checked in at Sandals Negril, she stepped into a carefully manufactured world. The sprawling resort promised indulgence, safety, and curated perfection. Tourists sipped cocktails at open-air bars, reggae music drifted across manicured gardens, and every inch of the property seemed designed to assure visitors that nothing could go wrong in paradise. But beneath the glossy exterior, there was an undercurrent that seasoned travelers often sensed. The stark contrast between the opulence of the resort and the surrounding local communities created an invisible tension. The Sandals brand thrived on maintaining appearances, and for Claudia, an observer by profession, it may have been impossible not to notice the cracks in the facade. Still, her first days in Negril were seemingly uneventful. Resort guests later remembered her walking along the beach with her notebook, often with a portable radio in hand. She wasn't the kind of tourist who disappeared into the crowd. She stood out because she seemed less interested in being entertained and more intent on taking everything in. Her focus, her curiosity, and her quiet presence made her memorable. Back home, her parents and friends knew little of these early hours. To them, Claudia was simply away on another assignment, doing what she loved. She had promised to call, and her reliability made them confident that she would. In her journal, which would later be found among her belongings, she wrote about the beach, the resort, and her impressions of Jamaica. The words suggested she was engaged, thoughtful, and immersed in her surroundings. Nothing in those entries hinted at unease. But paradise, as Claudia would soon discover, was never what it seemed. The Sandals Resort, like many destinations dependent on tourism, operated under a fragile balance. Guest safety was paramount, not only for ethical reasons but because the entire economy depended on maintaining the image of Jamaica as a carefree escape. What happened inside the resort rarely left its walls, and when problems arose, they were often handled quietly. Claudia, however, was an outsider with a journalist's eye. While she was not there to investigate wrongdoing, her presence was different from that of a casual tourist. She noticed details, she paid attention, and in the days leading up to her disappearance, she became a part of the fabric of Sandals Negril, visible, approachable, and distinctly remembered by those who saw her wandering along the shoreline. The last verified images of her, etched in the memories of fellow guests, were strikingly simple. Claudia, barefoot in a bikini, walking with her radio, the Caribbean sun beating down. She looked calm, perhaps contemplative, lost in her own world. These scenes felt ordinary at the time. In hindsight, they became haunting. No one could have imagined that a woman so full of life, on a work trip that was supposed to be routine, would vanish without a trace. Yet by the end of May, that is exactly what happened. The questions that would dominate the coming decades, questions about negligence, cover-ups, and hidden truths, had their roots in this serene beginning. Claudia's journey to Jamaica had started as a professional opportunity, a chance to turn an unexpected setback into an adventure. Instead, it would place her at the center of one of the Caribbean's most enduring mysteries. Paradise had welcomed her with open arms. But as the sun set over Negril, Paradise was preparing to swallow her whole. You're watching Trace of Evil, where we reveal true crimes, unsolved disappearances, and mysteries surrounding crime. Like and subscribe to watch more episodes from our channel. Let's get back into the story of Claudia Kirschhoch. By late May 2000, Claudia Kirschhoch's stay at Sandals Negril had taken on an unusual rhythm. What was meant to be a tightly scheduled press trip had become a series of unstructured days. The trip to Cuba had been canceled, and her assignment for Frommer's no longer demanded the same urgency. Claudia had time, more than she had expected, and she spent it absorbing her surroundings. Staff and guests would later recall seeing her walking alone along the beach, often barefoot, radio pressed to her ear. The music, a steady companion, seemed to match her unhurried pace. She spoke with people casually, sharing bits of conversation that revealed her thoughtful, easygoing nature. She wasn't reclusive, nor was she overly social. She was simply present, weaving herself quietly into the resort's atmosphere. But alongside these quiet observations, something else began to surface. Fellow travelers noticed that Claudia sometimes seemed restless, as though she was torn between enjoying the resort and seeking something more authentic beyond its manicured borders. Unlike the honeymooners and retirees who filled the rooms around her, Claudia wasn't there for indulgence. She was there because of circumstance, redirected, unanchored, and perhaps searching for meaning in a trip that had lost its original purpose. In the final days before her disappearance, Claudia struck up conversations with both staff members and locals who orbited the resort. She dined with guests, joined in casual chatter, and asked questions about life on the island. For a writer, this was natural. The details that made her stories real often came from such exchanges. But there was one encounter that stood out. Claudia was seen in the company of a man, a local DJ known by some around Negril. Witnesses later described him as friendly, charismatic, and well-acquainted with the nightlife scene. He wasn't an official part of the Sandals environment, but was familiar enough to drift in and out of resort spaces. Claudia spoke with him more than once, and it was clear they developed a rapport. On the evening of May 27th, Claudia was last definitively seen alive. Guests recalled her walking through the resort, still carrying her radio, still barefoot, the picture of casual ease. It was not a dramatic moment. There were no signs of distress or urgency. Yet, this ordinary sighting would become the final thread in her known story. The following day, Claudia failed to show up for breakfast. At first, it drew little attention. Guests come and go, schedules shift, and anonymity is often preserved in a place like Sandals. But as hours passed, staff began to notice her absence. Her bed was untouched, her belongings undisturbed, her passport and return ticket left behind. Nothing suggested she had planned to leave, not in the manner tourists usually do. Her parents in the United States grew worried almost immediately when calls went unanswered. Claudia was not careless when it came to communication. She valued her independence, but she also valued consistency, and silence was deeply out of character. The investigation, if it could be called that in its earliest hours, began with questions inside the resort. Who had seen her last? Where had she gone after her final walk along the shoreline? Was she with anyone? Attention turned quickly toward the local DJ. Witnesses remembered her speaking with him, and whispers spread that she may have left the resort in his company. He admitted to knowing Claudia, but his story shifted under scrutiny. At one point, he claimed he had given her a ride in his car, but he denied involvement in her disappearance. His accounts were inconsistent, fueling suspicion. Yet, without solid evidence, the suspicion remained just that, unproven. The lack of urgency in the early stages compounded the problem. Sandals' management, protective of its carefully constructed image, appeared reluctant to draw negative attention. Missing tourists were not a headline any resort wanted attached to its name. Critics would later accuse the resort of moving too slowly, of failing to preserve potential evidence, and of prioritizing reputation over responsibility. Meanwhile, Claudia's family, desperate and thousands of miles away, began pressing for answers. They called, wrote, and eventually flew to Jamaica, determined to piece together what had happened. To them, Claudia was not a fleeting guest, not a statistic, but a daughter who had vanished from a place that promised safety. Authorities in Jamaica did open an investigation, but progress was painfully slow. Witness interviews were inconsistent, leads evaporated, and crucial windows of time slipped by. With every passing day, the trail grew colder. One chilling discovery came when Claudia's personal belongings were examined. Her passport, identification, and clothing were still in her hotel room. These were not the actions of someone planning to leave. She had not packed, had not prepared, had not even taken the tools she would have needed to disappear voluntarily. Everything pointed to an abrupt interruption, an event she neither planned for nor consented to. By the end of that first week, the resort had returned to its normal rhythm. New guests arrived, music played, drinks were poured. But Claudia's absence lingered like an invisible shadow. Staff spoke about her quietly, and returning visitors who had noticed her presence before found themselves haunted by her sudden vanishing. For her parents, the nightmare had only begun. The unanswered phone calls, the vague reassurances, the shifting stories, all of it clashed with the image of paradise that had lured their daughter there in the first place. In Negril, the ocean waves rolled on as they always had, erasing footprints from the sand. Claudia's last walk along the beach was reduced to memory, her figure dissolving into the collective haze of a resort that wanted desperately to forget. But for her family, and for those who would later examine her case, forgetting was never an option. Something had happened to Claudia Kirschhoch in those final days of May 2000. What, and at whose hands, remained a question that grew heavier with time. When word of Claudia Kirschhoch's disappearance finally reached outside Negril, it was not through the resort's official channels but through her family's growing alarm. Her parents, Harry and Barbara, had waited days for calls that never came. Claudia was dependable, the kind of daughter who left itineraries, phoned when she traveled, and never strayed into silence. For her not to call was unthinkable. By early June 2000, they had made their way to Jamaica themselves. What greeted them was a wall of uncertainty. Sandals Negril seemed more concerned with maintaining its glossy facade than addressing the crisis unfolding in its midst. Guests lounged by the pools and dined in the open-air restaurants, while behind the scenes a family begged for answers. The Jamaican Constabulary Force assigned investigators, but from the start the inquiry showed signs of strain. Interviews with resort staff and guests yielded vague recollections. Many were tourists who had already departed, their memories of Claudia fleeting at best. Even those who remembered her could provide little beyond surface impressions. A woman with a radio, a smile, and a tendency to walk the beach alone. The strongest lead remained the local DJ who had befriended Claudia in her final days. Police questioned him repeatedly, noting his inconsistent statements. At first, he claimed to have merely spoken with her. Later, he admitted giving her a ride but insisted he had dropped her off safely. Rumors circulated that his car had been searched and that items of interest were found, though nothing definitive ever tied him to her disappearance. For Claudia's family, these inconsistencies were maddening. They pressed investigators to act decisively, to push harder, but progress was slow. Jamaica's law enforcement resources were stretched thin, and the disappearance of an American tourist, while troubling, was just one of many cases competing for attention. The U.S. Embassy became involved, adding diplomatic pressure. Officials urged cooperation, but jurisdiction remained firmly in Jamaican hands. This divide created gaps in communication, leaving Claudia's family caught between two systems, each claiming to pursue justice, neither producing concrete results. As days turned into weeks, Claudia's case grew colder. The lack of physical evidence was striking. No body, No belongings beyond those in her room. No trace of where she might have gone. Even the last confirmed sighting, walking barefoot with her radio, offered no clue as to whether she had left the resort voluntarily, been lured away, or met with violence nearby. Then came whispers of missed opportunities. Critics argued that the resort failed to secure Claudia's room in time, allowing staff to clean it and potentially erase vital evidence. Others suggested that surveillance, limited at the time, might have offered answers had it been preserved. Each accusation deepened the family's sense of betrayal. The Kirschhochs began speaking publicly. They described Claudia as bright, compassionate, and deeply loved. They reminded the world that behind the mystery was a daughter whose absence left an unfillable void. Their words drew media attention, but media attention was a double-edged sword. Stories of missing tourists cast long shadows over Jamaica's tourism industry, and not everyone welcomed the glare. Sandals, for its part, maintained that it had cooperated fully, but the Kirschhochs remained unconvinced. They believed the resort's priority had been to shield its reputation, not to help find their daughter. To them, Claudia's case symbolized a collision between corporate image and human tragedy. Investigators returned again and again to the local DJ. Though suspicion clung to him, the lack of hard evidence prevented charges. His association with Claudia was undeniable, but proving involvement in her disappearance was another matter entirely. Over time, official interest waned, and he slipped back into relative obscurity. For the Kirschhochs, every unanswered question grew heavier. Why would Claudia leave without her passport? Why would she vanish without her belongings? Why had the investigation failed to secure even the smallest piece of physical evidence? Theories multiplied in the vacuum. Some believed she had been the victim of foul play, possibly abducted or killed. Others speculated she had left the resort willingly and met with danger elsewhere. A few suggested she might have chosen to disappear, though those who knew her rejected this outright. Claudia was adventurous but grounded, independent but deeply connected to her family. Silence was not in her nature. By the close of summer 2000, the investigation had all but stalled. Leads had gone dry, witnesses had dispersed, and the case faded from headlines. Yet for her parents, time did not soften the wound. Every day was marked by the same absence, the same gnawing uncertainty. They returned home from Jamaica carrying only grief and unanswered questions. Claudia's room at Sandals Negril had been stripped, her presence erased as if she had never been there. But the Kirschhochs could not let go. They launched their own inquiries, contacted private investigators, and kept Claudia's name alive in media cycles whenever they could. The pain of not knowing, of living with an unresolved disappearance, became their daily reality. For them, Negril was no longer a place of paradise but a landscape of loss, a place where their daughter had walked into the Caribbean sun and never walked out again. By the first anniversary of her disappearance, the contrast was striking. At Sandals Negril, new guests sipped cocktails on the same beaches where Claudia had last been seen. Music played, waves lapped, life went on. But for the Kirschhochs, life was frozen in 2000, locked at the point where their daughter's voice fell silent. The investigation, though technically still open, had slipped into inertia. Unless new evidence emerged, Claudia's fate risked being swallowed by time, another name in the long list of missing persons whose stories remain unresolved. In the years following Claudia Kirschhoch's disappearance, the silence surrounding her case became its own kind of torment. For her parents, Harry and Barbara, every passing anniversary was a reminder that the trail had gone cold. The investigation in Jamaica had yielded little, and with no body, no suspect, and no clear narrative, Claudia's story drifted into the shadows of unsolved cases. The Kirschhochs refused to let her memory be swallowed. They organized press conferences, sat for interviews, and spoke with anyone who would listen. Their message was unwavering. Claudia was not just a missing tourist, not just another statistic. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She was a 29-year-old journalist with a career ahead of her and a family who would never stop searching. One persistent focus remained: the local DJ who had been closely associated with Claudia in her final days. Though suspicion lingered, no charges were ever filed. Over time, he faded back into the rhythms of Negril life. For Claudia's family, the lack of accountability only deepened their frustration. They believed strongly that someone knew what had happened, and that silence, whether motivated by fear, indifference, or protection, was shielding the truth. The Sandals Resort continued to thrive, its polished image largely untouched by the unresolved disappearance. To many new visitors, Claudia's name was unknown, her story absent from the brochures and advertisements. For the Kirschhochs, this erasure felt like another betrayal, a deliberate burying of a tragedy to protect profit. They believed that critical early evidence had been mishandled, perhaps intentionally, and that this failure had robbed Claudia of justice. Barbara and Harry became tireless advocates, not only for their daughter but for other families of the missing. They spoke about the importance of international cooperation, about the vulnerabilities of travelers, about the need for transparency when a life disappears in a foreign land. In doing so, they turned their grief into a broader call for change, though it came at the cost of their own peace. 2 decades after her disappearance, little had changed. The official investigation remained open but inactive, a case file gathering dust. For Claudia's family, the fight for answers was less about hope for her survival and more about the pursuit of truth, of finally knowing what had happened in Negril in 2000. Her story endures as both a personal tragedy and a haunting symbol of systemic failure. It reveals the fragile line between paradise and peril, the vulnerabilities of travelers in unfamiliar places, and the devastating consequences when institutions prioritize image over justice. For some, Jamaica's beaches remain a destination of escape. For others, especially the Kirschhoch family, they will forever be tied to an absence, to the day Claudia walked into the sun and never returned. In the end, Claudia's disappearance remains unsolved, her fate unknown. She is frozen in time at 29, her smile preserved in photographs, her voice echoed in memories. For her family, the absence is a wound that never closes. For the rest of us, her story is a reminder that behind every unsolved case is a human life, one that mattered deeply, one that still does. Claudia Kirschhoch vanished on a beach in Negril, but her absence lingers far beyond the Caribbean. It lingers in the silence of unanswered questions, in the determination of a family unwilling to forget, and in the haunting truth that sometimes people can disappear completely, leaving behind nothing but a void.